Hey guys, welcome back to the garage. And of course, this week's episode was supposed to be the finale of the engine tune-up procedure checklist mini-series we have going on, and we were going to finish that series off with a dyno session. Long story short, we're going to have to delay that by a couple of weeks because a dyno shop called me during the week and told me that they were having some technical difficulties with their dyno machine. So we're gonna have to push that out by a couple of weeks because that was the soonest that I could reschedule. But it's not that big of a deal, although I am pretty disappointed because there's a few more things that we want to do with the car anyway as part of the tune-up series. So we'll just go ahead and do those now that we don't really have a time crunch. So in this episode, we're gonna focus on two things. We're gonna change the engine oil and we're going to change out the coolant. In the next episode, we'll get to the transmission oil and the differential oil. I can't do that today because I'm just waiting for those gear oils to be delivered. So you can see that I have my car up on quick jack stands, which allows me to raise this car nice and high for easy access underneath the car. But you obviously don't need quick jacks to change your oil. You can just use jack stands, or you can use these rams, which are the simplest things. I love those for when I'm just changing the oil, but you really don't want to use rams like that, which tilts the nose of the car upward for changing out the coolant, because that puts the pool of coolant in the backside of the engine, and you're not going to be able to drain all of the coolant very well. So the first thing that we're going to do is drain the coolant, because I know it takes a while for all the coolant to flow out. And the first thing that you should do is just release the radiator cap. And of course, don't do this while the engine is hot because it'll blow up in your face. But given that the engine is all nice and cooled down, just remove the radiator cap so that you'll have an easier time draining the coolant. I don't exactly know how many quarts the capacity is, but 5-gallon jug like this should do the trick. So just place it right underneath the radiator and just release the drain cock for the coolant to flow out. Ooh, if you guys noticed that brown liquid just now, I think there is some rust in the car. So while the coolant is draining out, let's just quickly talk about what you actually should be using as your coolant. So the worst thing that you can realistically use is tap water. You know, if you're stuck on the side of the road because your engine overheated and you're running on basically no water, obviously tap water is better than nothing, but you don't want to use tap water in the long run because it contains a lot of minerals. Those minerals will eventually, as the coolant gets, some of it gets boiled off, those become a lot more concentrated, and if you use tap water for a pretty long time, there's going to be mineral buildup that happens in your engine and in your radiator, just like you see on your shower heads. So don't use tap water. If you must use water, use distilled water or some sort of filtered water that takes out all those mineral impurities. But just using water, even distilled water, is bad because, one, it's going to eventually corrode the engine. L28 or the Datsun blocks for us is cast iron. So if you continue to use water, it will eventually rust from the inside out, which is not great. So what you really want to use is obviously antifreeze, and hopefully that's common sense. So I just didn't want to breeze over. So there's two benefits to using something like this Prestone antifreeze. One, it lowers the freezing temperature of your coolant, so that even if it's 15 degrees out, you don't have an issue with starting your car because your coolant is frozen and your freeze plugs are all popped out. And two, it contains corrosion inhibitors, which means it'll protect your cast iron engine and all the other components from rusting. But for me, I'm not actually going to use this antifreeze just yet. What I'm going to do is use this, I guess, radiator super cleaner and flush. And this is great, especially for older engines, to use every once in a while, because I don't know if you noticed, but when I first opened up that drain cock, some brown liquid came out, and that is rust. So I know that I have maybe even just a little bit of a rust problem going on inside the coolant and the or the cooling system. So I do want to use something like this. And the directions are fairly simple. It's on the back. The general idea is you just top it off with distilled or filtered water. And then you put this in, go for a 6-hour drive, and this will hopefully reduce a lot of the rust issues that you have going on. And I don't think it's just rust, it's all those like mineral buildup and some, it's kind of like Drano for your engine, I think. After flushing that out though, we are going to replace the fluid with the antifreeze. So while the coolant drains, we are also going to drain the engine oil because that's just going to trickle out for like the next 20 minutes. So this is the oil pan, and you want to use this to drain the oil, and it is, I think, 21 millimeter socket. And by the way, you want to use kind of a clean pan. Obviously this one isn't new, and you can get fancier oil pans in this. I just like to use something like this because it allows me to inspect the oil a lot easier, especially because this thing is white. And this is 12 quarts, but it should be big enough to handle all of the oil that gets drained out. Get ready to move the pan just in case I miss. There we go. Black gold. So the reason why I'm changing out the engine oil right now isn't because it's due to be changed in terms of mileage. It's really more because of two reasons. One, I've been kind of romping on this car really pretty hard recently, so I just want to make sure that there's nothing funky going inside. Also because the engine, when I got the thing, had a pretty bad head gasket leak. So I want to confirm that that's not going on anymore. And two, I also used a lot of assembly lube when I was installing the rebuilt head on it. And the assembly lube is not supposed to sit in the car for long term. It will dissolve and mix with the engine oil, but you should eventually change the oil after about, I don't know, a few hundred miles, so that you get all of that gunk out and put in fresh oil. So that's why I'm changing the oil right now. Let's also talk about what oils to use. And there's a lot of debate online of what is the best oil to use on the L28. But long story short, it doesn't really matter as long as you use the right weight of oil. So the weight that you should be using is, I think 10W30 is recommended for the summer, and 10W40 is recommended, I think I had that backwards. So 10W40 is recommended for the summer, so a slightly thicker oil, and 10W30 is recommended for the winter. But honestly, I don't think it really matters. 10W30 or 10W40, either one is really fine. And when it comes to brands or choosing between synthetic and conventional oil, again, I don't think it really matters. The argument being, even the cheapest conventional oil that you find today is much better quality than what they used to use back in the 70s. So I don't think you have to be too specific about what oils to choose. But there seems to be one consensus when it comes to oils for the L28 engine. I don't know why. It is don't use Royal Purple engine oil, which is, people like to use that for very high performance engines, and it's even been proven that it helps you produce a little bit more power. But for some reason, Datsun owners hate Royal Purple. So I guess don't use that. I can't tell you why, because I don't know. But Mobil 1 synthetic high mileage motor oil is what I'm choosing to go with. A lot of people have had good results with this, so that's what I'm using. In terms of quantity, The oil capacity for the L28 is, I think, 5.5 quarts, and which is great news because this thing comes in 5 quarts, and I think 5 quarts is really all you need to use. You don't need to use 5.5 because there's oil that's inside the block that's not going to be completely drained out. So 5 quarts should be enough. And one thing to keep in mind, it's actually better to slightly be under your maximum oil capacity than be over. If you overfill the engine oil, you could have issues with it foaming and bubbling in the oil pan because it's just sitting, or the oil level is just sitting too high. So of course, whenever you're changing the engine oil, it is also a good idea to change out the filter as well. You want to just drain the engine oil before you take out the filter, so that there's no significant leaks, but changing out the filter is fairly simple. So I think I talked about this before. I really like using these strap type oil filter removers rather than these, because these wrench type oil filter removers tend to just crush the oil filter, and sometimes it doesn't even work. And I just didn't have much luck with these. Strap types have been working much better for me. And if your forearms are strong enough, you could probably just manhandle this out, but mine are not that strong. And of course, whenever you remove this, some oil will spill out, so just be ready for that. And I was not ready for that. So the oil filter that I used previously is this K&N filter, which is a bit more on the expensive side. I really shouldn't have, because I knew that this oil filter was going to be trashed long before it's actually due for a change. But the oil filter that I am putting back in is, where did it go? Oh, is this Fram unit, which is much cheaper. I think it's actually like half the price. But again, you can ask a bunch of people what oil filter you should use. In my opinion, I don't think it really matters either. Just whatever fits the engine. And again, I think the logic is because the best oil filter that they used to use is probably not as good as the cheapest filters that you use today. So before we install this on, we want to do a couple of things. We want to make sure that this rubber O-ring actually came out with the old unit. And well, you guys can't tell, but this filter is much, much heavier than this filter. And the reason is because there's a bunch of oil inside. So you don't want to install the air filter dry, or sorry, the oil filter dry. You want to pour a little bit of engine oil to, I guess, prime the system so that whenever you first start your car, you're not starting it with a dry filter. And so we're not going to fill it up all the way. We're just going to fill it up a little bit. All right, that should be good. And ooh, I may have put in too much in there. So our oil filter is installed, so let's go check on the engine oil. Especially when you're working on old engines, at every oil change you want to inspect the oil. And what you're inspecting for is not necessarily the color. And you shouldn't worry about the color being like black, because that's just what old engine oil turns into. So what you should be checking for is consistency of the liquid. You don't want to see foaming, you don't want to see different layers of the liquid, because that generally means that either fuel got inside the system or maybe even worse, water, which means that you probably have a head gasket leak. But this oil looks really, really good. It's dirty, but it's good. And one more thing that you kind of want to do is just take a magnet and run it through the bottom of the oil and check for any metal flakes. And it's unlikely to happen, but you want to be thorough. So obviously you don't want to see any metal flakes, and I don't see any, so we're all good. So now that all the engine oil has been drained and we have the new engine oil filter installed, we're going to install back the drain bolt. Oh, by the way, if you have one, go ahead and replace the crush ring or the rubber O-ring. This seems to be just a rubber unit. But if you have a new one, go ahead and replace that so your drain doesn't leak. But I don't have a new one, so I'm just going to reinstall this one. And you don't have to over tighten this. Just tight enough so that it won't come loose and it won't leak. If you over tighten this and break off the bolt, you're in for a major headache. So don't do that. Rest of the oil changing process is really pretty simple. Place a funnel at the valve cover and just pour your oil in. Alright, that's all 5 quarts, and you're done replacing the oil on your Datsun Straight 6, or whatever engine you have. So the coolant finally finished draining, so we can go ahead and inspect the liquid. And you guys can see that it's mostly clear, because despite what I told you guys earlier, I had used mostly distilled water with a little bit of antifreeze, and that was because of 2 reasons. One, I knew that the coolant wasn't going to be sitting in there for long, so I wasn't that worried about the engine corroding from inside out over time. And 2, I wanted to have an easier time inspecting the liquid, and water is certainly easier to inspect. So the liquid is pretty clear. I can see to the bottom of the bucket, and I just don't see much in here, which is great. And the water looks pretty clean. Obviously there is some rust that came out, which is why we're going to be flushing the entire system. We're going to go ahead and close up the drain cock. And lower the car. By the way, if you guys ever need to drain the block completely of coolant for whatever reason, there is a drain plug on the side of the block, and it's this thing right here. So you can use this to drain any extra water that's still sitting in the block, but most of the times you won't have to do that. So the car has been lowered so we can go ahead and refill the radiator. By the way, don't use the same funnel that you were using to fill in the engine oil for obvious reasons. If you have to, please clean it off thoroughly because you don't want engine oil getting in your coolant system. So what I am using to refill the radiator is distilled water. I actually have a reverse osmosis filtration system inside, which is why I have the water in buckets right now. I'm going to refill the radiator with this distilled water. So the radiator's not quite all the way full right now, but I am going to start up the car to let it warm up and let it burp out some of the coolant so that I can add in more water. The biggest mistake that people make when refilling in their coolant system is to fill it up to the top and just going ahead and closing the radiator cap. What that prevents the car from doing is getting rid of the air bubbles that might be trapped inside the engine, and if there's air bubbles trapped inside the water jackets, that's not good because the coolant won't be able to flow as easily. So that leads to spots in the engine that are becoming overheated, and that's no good. So whenever you're whenever you're filling up the coolant, go ahead and fill it up pretty near the top, turn on the engine, let it warm up for about 10 minutes, and you'll see air bubbles coming out of the radiator. And at that point, you can either fill it up more, or if you stop noticing the air bubbles, you can just go ahead and close the radiator cap at that point. So what I decided to do was actually put the car on these ramps to raise the front of the car to help it burp out all of the air bubbles through, the highest point in the cooling system, which is this radiator cap or the radiator inlet right here. So I'm going to turn on the car and just let it sit for about 10 minutes while it burps out all of the oil, all of the air. Cool, so as you guys saw, all of the bubbles have been burped out. It got a little messy and I got a lot of water splashed on me, but thankfully it wasn't antifreeze that splashed all over the place. So let's put in our flush or the super cleaner. Don't do this if you think it's gonna get below freezing where you live, because this does not contain any antifreeze. Cool, so this little container should take care of up to 12 quarts, which is fine because our capacity is only 11 anyway. So we are all filled up. Reinstall your radiator cap. Make sure it's nice and tight. And so for the flush procedure, now I need to drive the car for at least 6 hours. It doesn't have to be 6 hours all in one shot, obviously. It can be over the course of days, and it's probably better to do it in the course of at least a few days, so that you give the liquid enough time to just kind of break down all of the gunk and crap inside the block and the radiator. But that is a good enough excuse for me to go out for a drive on this beautiful Saturday afternoon. So I will see you guys later. In the next episode, we will take care of the transmission fluid and the differential fluid as soon as those things come in. I do have some, but not enough. So I just have some left over from the last time I did it. So I'll look forward to that, and I'll see you guys next time. I'm gonna go for a drive.